The video they posted was 31 seconds long. 31 seconds of two young people laughing, pointing, mocking a framed photograph on a wall, a silver cross on a blue ribbon, a man in uniform, 19 years old, looking straight into the camera like he already knew what was coming. The caption read, "Found this dusty old thing at a garage sale lol, who even keeps this stuff face with tears of joy junk hunting thrift flip aesthetic." It had 47,000 likes by Sunday morning. By Monday, it had been deleted. By Tuesday, federal investigators had already made a phone call. And by the following spring, everything those two young people had built, every sponsorship, every follower, every dollar, every dream, was gone. Let me tell you about Chester Raymond Holloway, and let me tell you about the medal they laughed at. Picture Dunmore Falls, Ohio. Not Columbus, not Cleveland, not anywhere you'd find on a tourist map. Dunmore Falls is a town of about 12,000 people, tucked into the rolling hills of Licking County, 40 minutes east of the state capital. The kind of place where the grain elevator is still the tallest building on the skyline, where the high school football field gets lit up on Friday nights and half the town shows up in bleachers that have been cold since September. The neighborhoods there are old, not historic old, not charming old, just settled old. The kind of old that means the trees have grown tall enough to arch over the streets in summer and turn the road into a green cathedral. Sycamore Lane was one of those streets. 8 houses on the east side, 7 on the west. A dead end capped by a small pond where kids fished for bluegill every summer since before anyone could remember. American flags on most of the mailboxes. A hand-painted wooden sign at the entrance that read, "Welcome to Sycamore Lane, established 1951. On summer evenings in that neighborhood, you could smell charcoal grills and fresh-cut grass. You could hear the sound of screen doors creaking open and the distant bark of somebody's beagle. The cicadas came every year without fail, filling the air with that low electric hum that people from Ohio know in their bones. It was, in every sense of the word, a quiet place. It had been quiet for a long time. That changed in the summer of 2021. Master Sergeant Chester Raymond Holloway, United States Army, retired. Born March 9, 1932 in Zanesville, Ohio. Enlisted at 17, lying about his age the way young men sometimes did in those days, hunger and pride mixing into something that felt like courage. Shipped out in the fall of 1950. Assigned to the 7th Infantry Division, 31st Infantry Regiment. Landed at Incheon. Fought through the Chasen Reservoir campaign in temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero, in a country that felt like the far side of the moon. He came back in 1953. He didn't talk about it, not for decades. He stayed in the Army because staying in was simpler than figuring out what else to do. He did 2 more tours, served in Germany, served at Fort Bragg, finished his career as a training sergeant who had a reputation for being exactly as hard as he needed to be and not one bit harder. He retired in 1978 with 28 years of service, a chest full of decorations, and a handshake from a general whose name he never mentioned to anyone. He came back to Dunmore Falls, married a woman named Evelyn, raised 2 daughters, worked for years at a hardware store, then as a handyman, fixing things with the same quiet precision he'd applied to everything else in his life. Evelyn passed in 2014, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. After that, Chester stayed in the house on Sycamore Lane. He tended the garden. He fed the birds. Every morning, rain or shine, he sat on the front porch in a wooden rocking chair his son-in-law had made for him, drank 1 cup of black coffee, and watched the street wake up. He was 89 years old in the summer of 2021. He still stood straight as a fence post. The neighbors knew him as Mr. Chester. The kids on the block called him that too, Mr. Chester, who always had a peppermint in his shirt pocket and who once helped a 9-year-old girl build a birdhouse that still hung in her family's backyard. Mr. Chester, who remembered every kid's name, every birthday, every scraped knee. There was one thing about Chester Holloway that nobody on Sycamore Lane talked about out loud, though everyone knew it. In the front room of his house, on the wall above the fireplace, hung a framed photograph, a young soldier in dress uniform, a blue ribbon, a silver cross. The Medal of Honor. Awarded in 1951 for actions during the Battle of Chasen Reservoir that Chester Holloway still would not describe in full, even 70 years later. He'd earned it at 20 years old, carrying wounded men through a frozen valley under enemy fire for 3 hours alone, while every other man in his unit was either dead or pinned down. He never displayed it to impress anyone. He never brought it up. It was just there on the wall, a fact of who he was. The house at the end of the lane, 14 Sycamore, had been empty since old Bill Purcell moved into assisted living in January of 2021. It sat vacant for 6 months. The lawn went to seed, the gutters sagged, the neighbors took turns picking up the mail that piled up in the box just to keep the place looking lived in. And then, in August of that year, a pearl-white 2020 Range Rover Sport pulled slowly down Sycamore Lane, windows tinted dark bass thumping something that vibrated the mailboxes, and parked in front of number 14. Out stepped 2 people. Bryce Calloway, 26. 6'2", jaw like a movie poster, wearing a vintage band shirt that had been deliberately distressed at a store in Columbus for $65. He'd grown up in Dublin, Ohio, a suburb of money and manicured lawns, the son of a patent attorney who had funded Bryce's creative career since college. And beside him, Kaylee Voss, 24, former communications student, University of Cincinnati. She moved like someone who was always aware of where the light was falling. Together, they ran a lifestyle channel called the Calloway Cast. At the time of their move to Sycamore Lane, they had approximately 1.2 million followers on their primary platform, another 400,000 on a secondary one. They made their living through brand deals, cookware, vitamin supplements, a clothing line with their name on it. Combined, they were pulling somewhere between $18,000 and $22,000 a month in sponsorship revenue. They had purchased 14 Sycamore as a content house. Their words, they'd said it in a vlog the week before the move. "We're going full cottagecore meets mid-century modern, you guys. This neighborhood is so underrated, it's going to be perfect for the brand." Their first red flag arrived before the moving truck did. Chester was on his porch that morning when Bryce walked across the lawn, not the sidewalk, but across the lawn, and stopped at the edge of Chester's property. "Hey man," he said, no introduction, no handshake, just, "Hey man, we're going to be filming out front a lot, just so you know, try not to be in the background too much, it messes with the aesthetic." Chester looked at him for a long moment. "Good morning," Chester said, that was all. Bryce blinked, then he laughed, "Yeah, morning," and walked back across the lawn. That was it, that was the first conversation. And on Sycamore Lane, on that warm August morning with the smell of cut grass in the air and the cicadas singing in the old oak trees, something shifted. 3 days after Bryce and Kaylee moved in, the filming started. It was constant, ring lights set up on the porch at 10 o'clock at night, a drone that buzzed low over the neighborhood at 7 in the morning to get establishing shots, delivery trucks arriving every other day, and music, loud, repetitive, the same instrumental loop over and over because it was royalty-free and worked for their transitions. The neighbors tolerated it, it was new, people settle in, give it time. Chester said nothing for 2 full weeks. But then came the Wednesday morning when Bryce's production van, a rented white cargo van parked overnight, was blocking Chester's driveway, not partially, fully. Chester had a doctor's appointment, an infusion for a blood condition that required monthly treatment at the clinic in Newark. He needed to leave at 8:15. At 8 o'clock, Chester walked down the lane and knocked on the door of number 14. Kaylee answered, holding a ring light diffuser and a cup of green tea. She stared at him the way you stare at someone you've never actually looked at before. Chester explained calmly that the van was blocking his exit, that he had a medical appointment, that if they could move it, he'd appreciate it. She called for Bryce. Bryce appeared in the doorway in sweatpants, hair still flat from sleep, already annoyed. "Look," he said, "we needed the van positioned there for a shot. We're doing a morning routine video. Can't you just, call a car?" Chester didn't raise his voice, he never did. "I have a car," Chester said. "It's in my driveway, you're blocking it." "It'll be 30 minutes tops, we're almost done." "My appointment is at 8:30. Bryce sighed loudly like Chester had asked him to carry something heavy. I mean, we're kind of in the middle of a shoot here. Can't you go around? Chester looked at him steadily. There is no around, he said. That's a dead end. Bryce looked past him, looked at the van, looked back at Chester, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Not quite embarrassment, not quite shame, something smaller, something that died before it could grow. Fine, he said. Kaylee, go move it. The van moved. Chester made his appointment with 4 minutes to spare. But when he returned home that afternoon, he noticed something. The production camera on Bryce and Kaylee's porch, the wide-angle one they used for ambient footage, was now angled slightly toward Chester's house. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went inside. That evening, Chester Holloway called his daughter in Columbus, a woman named Patricia who worked as a paralegal and who had inherited her father's quiet, careful mind. Patty, he said, I think I'm going to need to start keeping a log. Direct hit. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to be completely reasonable with someone who sees your reasonableness as weakness, who treats your patience like permission? Drop a comment below and tell me your story. Because I promise you, on Sycamore Lane, Chester Holloway was about to find out what that really looks like. September arrived with a cool front and the smell of leaves starting to turn. Chester's log, a ruled composition notebook that he dated and initialed at the top of every page, began to fill. September 4th, trash bags left at the edge of his property line, 3 of them. Their bin was 6 feet away. September 9th, drone footage captured from Chester's side of the fence. He could see the footage on their public channel the following day, a shot of his backyard garden used as background ambience in a home tour video. No permission asked. September 14th, a complaint filed with the Dunmore Falls Code Enforcement Office, alleging that Chester's garden shed was in violation of a property setback ordinance. It was not. The inspector confirmed this after a 15-minute visit and closed the case the same day. September 22nd, Chester's mailbox, a vintage post-mounted box that Evelyn had picked out in 1987, painted white with small blue cornflowers she'd stenciled herself. When Chester went to retrieve his mail that morning, the post had been snapped at the base. Clean break, like something had hit it hard and fast. No note, no apology, no knock on his door. Chester took photographs. He measured the angle of impact. He wrote it down. October, the garden that Evelyn had planted, the one Chester tended every year like a living memory of her, began to suffer. The roses along the shared fence line started dying, not all at once, just the ones closest to the fence, leaves yellowing, roots poisoned. Chester dug one up carefully, photographed the root ball, took a sample to the county extension office. Herbicide applied from the other side of the fence, concentrated enough to be deliberate. He wrote that down too. And through all of it, the camera on his porch, the drone over his roof, the code complaint, the broken mailbox, the poisoned roses, Bryce and Kaylee kept posting, kept growing, hit 1.4 million followers in October, landed a deal with a luxury candle company worth $11,000 for 2 posts. They did a neighborhood tour video in which Sycamore Lane appeared dreamy and picturesque, and the dead roses along the fence were neatly out of frame. Chester watched it once. He closed his laptop. He poured himself a second cup of coffee, which he almost never did. And then he made a phone call to a man named James Alderman. Now let me pause here again and ask you, did you notice something? Back at the beginning of our story, Chester made a comment to his daughter Patty about keeping a log. You might have thought that was just an old man being careful, but here's what you need to understand about Chester Holloway. He spent 28 years in the United States Army training other men to document, to observe, to prepare. That notebook was going to matter. A lot. It happened on a Tuesday in November. A gray, flat-skied Tuesday morning with the temperature just above freezing and the smell of wood smoke drifting up from somebody's chimney 2 streets over. Chester was at his kitchen table reading. He heard the car door, he heard voices, he heard laughter, but that wasn't unusual anymore. What was unusual was the sound that came a minute later. A hard metallic clang. Then another. Chester rose from the table, walked to the front room, and looked through the window. Bryce Calloway was standing at the edge of his property with a camera on a tripod, filming. Kaylee was beside him with a phone in her hand, recording vertical video, one hand pressed to her mouth like she was trying not to laugh. On the ground in the middle of Sycamore Lane was the photograph. The one from above the fireplace. Somehow, Chester would learn later from a neighbor's doorbell camera that it had been Kaylee, who first spotted it during a garage sale in September, purchased it for $3 along with a box of knickknacks while Chester was at his infusion appointment. Assuming it was decorative and the house was empty, the framed photograph of young Chester Holloway in his dress uniform, with the Medal of Honor hanging from the blue ribbon around his neck, was in their hands. They had posted the video that Sunday. Found this dusty old thing at a garage sale lol, who even keeps this stuff face with tears of joy junk hunting thrift flip aesthetic. What Chester was seeing now on this gray Tuesday was them filming a follow-up content piece. A "we got called out" video. They were standing in the lane, laughing about the comments, reading some of the angry ones aloud in mocking voices, rolling their eyes. "It's literally just a cross on a ribbon, calm down, internet," Kaylee said on camera, grinning. Chester watched from his window. He did not go outside. He watched for 2 minutes, then he went to the kitchen. He sat down, he placed both hands flat on the table. He breathed. He thought about the valley at Chawson, he thought about the temperature, he thought about the men he had carried, he thought about Evelyn, he thought about his daughters, he thought about everything that metal had ever meant and everything it still meant and the weight of it, the terrible and beautiful weight of it. He breathed again. Then he picked up his phone and called James Alderman. "Jim," he said, "I think it's time. Direct hit if you think Chester Holloway is going to let this go. You have fundamentally misunderstood who Chester Holloway is. And here's what nobody on Sycamore Lane knew. Here's what Bryce and Kaylee Calloway had absolutely no idea about. Stay with me. Here's what nobody knew at the time. James Alderman, Jim, to Chester, had served with him in the Army. Not at Chawson. That was before Jim's time. But they'd served together at Fort Bragg in the late 1960s, and they had stayed close for 60 years the way that some men do, the kind of close that doesn't require regular phone calls because the friendship is simply a fact of both their lives. Jim Alderman had retired from the Army in 1985 as a colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the Army's legal branch. He'd spent the back half of his career as a military lawyer of some distinction. After retirement, he'd built a second career in Ohio civil law. He was now 78 years old, technically retired from practice, but licensed, sharp, and deeply connected in ways that mattered. He had a former clerk who was now a Licking County Circuit Court judge. He had a former colleague who was a senior attorney with the Ohio Attorney General's office. And he had, it turned out, a very specific area of expertise that nobody at 14 Sycamore Lane could have anticipated. Because James Alderman had spent 11 years of his legal career working on cases involving the Federal Medal of Honor Protection Act. Yes, that's a real law, passed in 2006 and expanded since. It is a federal felony to steal, purchase, or knowingly possess a Medal of Honor that was awarded to someone else. The penalty can include up to a year in federal prison. And it is a separate federal offense under 18 U.S.C. Section 704, the Stolen Valor Act, to use a military decoration in a manner intended for commercial gain. That video, with its hashtags, its brand partnership disclosures at the bottom of the frame, its placement on a monetized channel, constituted exactly that. Jim had been aware of the missing photograph since October, when Chester had noticed it gone, and assumed it had been misplaced during a visit from his granddaughter. The doorbell camera footage Chester's neighbor had preserved it showed Kaylee picking up the photograph at the garage sale, examining it, and placing it in a bag. The sale had been held while Chester was at his medical appointment. The neighbor running the sale, an elderly woman named Gloria Tate, had no idea what she'd accidentally let go of. Jim Alderman had also, quietly, over the preceding 8 weeks, been reviewing Chester's composition notebook. The herbicide applied to Evelyn's roses, tortious interference with property, potential malicious destruction. The drone footage taken of Chester's private property without consent, violation of Ohio's drone privacy statute, enacted in 2016. The false code enforcement complaint, filed in writing with a signature, potentially actionable as filing a fraudulent report. The broken mailbox, federal property if Chester had a USPS-designated box, which he did. Jim Alderman had been thorough. By November, he had 6 separate legal filings ready to go. And he had one more thing. He had made a call to a former colleague, a woman named Rebecca Shore, now a senior investigator with the Federal Trade Commission's Division of Advertising Practices, who had been for several months already looking at the Callaway cast for undisclosed paid promotions. A practice that in influencer culture is commonplace, and also technically illegal under FTC guidelines. The Medal of Honor video had given Shore's office the opening they needed to formalize the investigation. Chester Holloway knew all of this by the second week of November. He went to his front porch, he sat in the rocking chair his son-in-law made for him, he drank his morning coffee. He watched the street. He waited. It was a Wednesday morning in December. The temperature was 28 degrees. The sky was the color of old pewter. There was a thin skin of ice on the pond at the end of the lane, and the bare branches of the oaks made sharp lines against the pale sky. Chester Holloway was on his porch at 7:45. He had his coffee. He had his coat. He was in his rocking chair. At 8 o'clock, a black Chevrolet Suburban turned onto Sycamore Lane. Behind it, a Licking County Sheriff's Cruiser. Behind that, a second unmarked vehicle. They parked in front of 14 Sycamore. Chester sipped his coffee. Bryce came to the door in a hoodie and athletic pants, barefoot, sleep still in his eyes. He opened the door and looked at the vehicles. His face went through several changes in quick succession: confusion, then irritation, then something that was not quite fear but was pointing in that direction. A man in a dark jacket with a federal credential showed it to Bryce at the door. The conversation lasted 47 seconds. At the end of it, Bryce Callaway stepped backward into his own house and sat down on the floor of his entryway. Just sat down, like his legs had made a decision his brain hadn't caught up to yet. Process servers arrived at 8:20 with the civil complaint. 7 causes of action filed in Licking County Circuit Court and in Federal District Court simultaneously. Malicious property destruction, privacy violations under Ohio statute, fraudulent regulatory complaint, damage to federally designated property, illegal possession of a Medal of Honor, commercial misuse of a military decoration under the Stolen Valor Act. The total damages sought $1.2 million plus legal fees and injunctive relief. The FTC sent a formal notice of investigation the same morning, delivered digitally to the business email address registered to the Callaway Cast LLC, the entity through which they received all brand payments. Their agent, a talent representative in Columbus who managed 3 other mid-sized influencer accounts, received a copy as well. By 9:15 that morning, 2 of their 4 major brand partners had suspended their contracts pending the outcome of the investigation. A third terminated outright. The Candle Company, which had a morality clause written into their agreements as standard practice, sent a termination letter that arrived electronically at 9:41 a.m. Kaylee saw it on her phone. She was sitting at the kitchen table. She did not cry, she just sat very still, the way people sometimes do when they understand, for the first time, the full dimensions of the hole they have dug. At 10 o'clock, the Medal of Honor, still in its frame, wrapped now in a soft cloth the federal investigator had brought specifically for that purpose, was returned to Chester Holloway. He stood at his front door. He received it with both hands. He thanked the investigator by name. He carried it back to its place above the fireplace. He straightened it. He stepped back and looked at it for a moment. Then he went to put the kettle on. Direct hit. Now let me ask you something. I want you to think about every quiet person in your life, every older neighbor, every grandparent, every veteran you've ever passed on the street without really seeing. What do you actually know about who they are, what they've done, what they carry? Drop a comment. I genuinely want to know. By the following afternoon, the original video had been deleted. It didn't matter. Nothing on the internet is ever truly deleted. Screenshots had spread across platforms within hours of the filing going public. Local news in Columbus picked it up on Thursday. A veterans advocacy publication ran a longer piece by Friday. By the weekend, the story had been shared by 2 senators, one from Ohio, one from the Senate Armed Services Committee, on their public accounts. The Callaway cast lost 300,000 followers in 4 days. Their remaining brand partner, a fitness supplement company, issued a statement indicating they were reviewing their partnership values. They terminated the following week. The talent agency dropped them. Their YouTube channel was demonetized pending FTC review. On Sycamore Lane, the neighbors didn't celebrate. That's not what people do there. Gloria Tate brought Chester a pie, apple, his favorite. The young couple 3 houses down, the ones with the 2 little girls who called him Mr. Chester, came by on Saturday morning and asked if he needed anything done around the house before winter. He told them the gutters could use a look. The husband was up there within the hour. Nobody on the street talked about Bryce and Kaylee very much. There wasn't much to say. They were people who had flown past this neighborhood like something bright and fast, and now they were gone in every way that mattered before they'd even packed a box. The civil case settled 11 months later out of court. Under the terms of the settlement, which Chester's attorney, James Alderman, negotiated with the unhurried patience of a man who had absolutely nowhere to be, Bryce Callaway and Kaylee Voss paid a combined civil judgment of $618,000. That figure covered property damages, legal costs, emotional distress, and a separate sum directed at the restoration of Evelyn's Rose Garden, which Chester had specifically requested be itemized. On the criminal matter, Bryce entered a deferred prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors on the Medal of Honor possession charge. He completed 200 hours of community service, which his attorney arranged to be served at a veterans support organization in Columbus. Whether or not that changed anything inside Bryce Callaway, nobody on Sycamore Lane could say. The FTC matter resulted in a formal consent decree and a fine of $74,000 levied against the Callaway Cast, LLC. The company had already dissolved by the time the decree was finalized. Kaylee Voss moved back to Cincinnati. She started over quietly. People who knew her said she didn't talk about what happened. Bryce Callaway made one more attempt at a content channel 18 months later. It lasted 6 weeks. The comments, as they say, were not kind. And on Sycamore Lane. The following spring, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Hollies moved into 14 Sycamore. She brought with her a tabby cat named Biscuit and a collection of wind chimes that made a sound like faraway rain on warm evenings. She introduced herself to Chester on her first morning. She brought coffee cake wrapped in a dish towel. She said, "I've been told you're the one to know on this street." Chester smiled. It took a moment. Smiling was something he'd always had to warm into. "I've been here a while," he said. "I can tell," she said. She looked at the rocking chair, the porch, the hand-stenciled mailbox that had been rebuilt, same white, same blue cornflowers, by his son-in-law the previous winter. "You've got the look of someone who belongs somewhere." Chester considered that. "I do," he said. That fall, Patricia came home for the holiday and noticed something. Along the fence line, the one that ran between Chester's property and the house next door, new rose canes had come up, thin and green and reaching, not the old bushes exactly, but the roots had survived, deep enough that even the herbicide hadn't reached them, and now they were coming back. She pointed it out to her father. Chester stood at the fence and looked at them for a long time. "Your mother always said they were tougher than they looked," he said. "You know, there's something I think about when I tell stories like this one. We live in a world that moves very fast, a world where the loudest voice thinks it wins, where attention is mistaken for importance and followers are mistaken for legacy." Bryce and Kaylee Callaway had 1.4 million people watching them, and not a single one of those 1.4 million people would have known Chester Holloway's name. But Chester Holloway once carried wounded men through a frozen valley in a country on the other side of the world, in the dark, alone, in temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in an hour. He did it without hesitation, without cameras, without anyone watching. He did it because those men were his brothers and because some things simply have to be done. And 70 years later, he still woke up at the same time every morning, made his coffee the same way, sat in the same chair, kept his house, kept his word, kept a notebook because he was the kind of man who understood that documentation is just another form of discipline. He never asked for anything except to be left in peace. He never threatened anyone. He never raised his voice. He just waited. You see, folks, there's a kind of person in this world who the loud and the careless never learn to recognize in time. They move through life assuming that quiet equals weakness, that old equals irrelevant, that patience is the same thing as surrender. It is not. Chester Holloway is 93 years old now. He sits on his porch on Sycamore Lane in the mornings. He drinks his coffee. He listens to the birds. He watches the roses grow along the fence. The Medal of Honor hangs above the fireplace where it has always hung. And on Sycamore Lane, the street is quiet again. It is the kind of quiet that belongs to someone. Remember this. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never mistake patience for permission. And never, ever, ever pick a fight with a man who has already survived the worst thing you can imagine and came home and made his coffee and sat down in his rocking chair and simply decided to wait. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone in your life, a veteran, a grandparent, someone who deserved better, share it. Let them know their quiet is seen. Let them know their story matters. We'll see you next time. This story is inspired by real events and public court records. Names, locations, and specific details have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.